the McStay family. In early February 2010, a young California family of 4 vanished from their newly purchased home in San Diego County. They left behind eggs and fruit rotting on the kitchen counter, their dogs locked in the backyard, and their family truck sitting in the driveway. For nearly 4 years, no one knew if they were alive or dead. The case would be quietly closed by California investigators as a voluntary disappearance to Mexico. Then, on a stretch of Mojave Desert off Interstate 15, an off-road motorcyclist would make a discovery that changed everything. Joseph McStay, 40 years old, his wife Summer, 43, and their 2 young sons, Gianni and Joseph Jr., lived on Avocado Vista Lane in Fallbrook, California. Joseph ran a custom decorative fountain business based out of San Clemente. He worked on it closely with 2 business associates, a welder and fabricator named Charles Chase Merritt and a web designer named Dan Cavanaugh. The family had only recently moved into the Fallbrook home. They were settling in. How does an entire family of 4 leave their home in the middle of an ordinary week, leaving food on the counter and pets in the yard with no one ever seeing them go? The family was reported missing on February 15, 2010. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department initially investigated the case as a missing persons matter. According to investigative reporter Caitlin Rother, the McStays had left so abruptly that they had eggs and fruit rotting on the kitchen counter, their Dodge truck still parked in the driveway, and their dogs abandoned in the backyard without food. Surveillance video that appeared to show a family of 4 resembling the McStays crossing the border into Mexico at San Isidro led one detective to conclude they had voluntarily left the country. The McStays' abandoned Isuzu Trooper was later found near the U.S. and Mexico border. For 3.5 years, the case remained quiet. Then, on November 11, 2013, an off-road motorcyclist discovered a piece of skull off Interstate 15 in San Bernardino County. That single piece of bone led investigators to the family's remains in 2 shallow desert graves, less than 20 miles from Merritt's home. A 3-pound sledgehammer that investigators said was used to kill the family was buried alongside their remains. The bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma. Charles Chase Merritt was arrested in November 2014, 1 year after the desert discovery. Prosecutors argued he had been forging checks linked to the business and was about to be cut out by Joseph, who had told Merritt on February 1, 2010, that he owed $42,845. The trial began in January 2019 and lasted nearly 6 months. On June 10, 2019, Merritt was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder with a special circumstance multiple murder finding. Key evidence included cell phone tracking data prosecutors said placed Merritt near the desert gravesite. The same jury recommended 3 death sentences for the killings of Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr., and life without parole for the killing of Joseph Sr. On January 21, 2020, Judge Michael A. Smith sentenced Merritt to death. Patrick McStay, Joseph's father, told Merritt at sentencing, "I hope you burn in hell." California has a moratorium on death row executions and has not executed an inmate since 2006. Merritt has since been transferred to the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in Otay Mesa, San Diego County. He is reportedly working on his appeal and is expected to file a writ of habeas corpus. He maintains his innocence to this day, calling prosecutors professional liars. In June 2025, New York Times best-selling author Caitlin Rother published a book questioning the conviction. She argued that there was no blood at the Fallbrook house, tying Merritt forensically to the scene, that cell phone evidence may have been flawed, and that the defense's alternative suspect, Dan Cavanaugh, had a claim of being in Hawaii on the day of the disappearance that was never verified by a flight manifest. The McStay family has publicly supported the jury's verdict. On November 15, 2024, The two adult sets of remains were officially identified as Joseph and Summer. The case is one of the few in modern California history to mix a death sentence, a moratorium on execution, and an active appeal effort all at the same time. The next case takes us back to Christmas Eve, 1945, where a West Virginia family would lose 5 children to a midnight house fire that left no trace of bodies behind. The Sodder children. On Christmas Eve, 1945, a coal trucking family in rural West Virginia put their 9 youngest children to bed. Around midnight, the mother heard a strange phone call. About an hour later, she heard something hit the roof. At 1 a.m, she woke to flames in her husband's office. 5 of the children would never be seen again. No bones were found in the rubble. The family ladder had been moved. The phone line had been cut. The coroner ruled them dead within hours. Their parents would spend the rest of their lives convinced that their children had been taken alive. George Sodder had immigrated to the United States from Sardinia, Italy, in 1908 at the age of 13, eventually building a successful coal trucking company. He married Jenny Cipriani, also a child immigrant from Italy, in 1922. They raised 10 children in a 2-story timber frame house 2 miles north of Fayetteville. One county magistrate later called the family one of the most respected middle-class families around. George was outspoken in his criticism of the fascist Mussolini government, and that opposition occasionally clashed with other Italian Americans in town. How does a family with 10 children in a small American mountain town in 1945 lose 5 of them in a single night and never recover a single set of remains? On December 24, 1945, 9 of the Sodders' 10 children were home. The oldest son, Joe, had been discharged from the Army the day before, but was not at the house. Around midnight, Jenny was awakened by a wrong number phone call ending in what she described as a strange laugh. About half an hour later, she heard something like a rubber ball hit the roof. At about 1 a.m, she awoke to flames in George's office. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children escaped. The other 5 children were never seen again. George tried to re-enter through a window. He cut his arm. The family ladder was inexplicably missing from its usual spot. His 2 trucks would not start. The phone line had been cut. A man would later admit to cutting the lines while stealing equipment from an outbuilding. Fire trucks did not arrive until 8 a.m. The most disturbing pieces of the case were the warnings that had come before the fire. Months earlier, a stranger pointing at the home's fuse boxes had said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." A life insurance salesman, irate after George refused his pitch, warned that George's house was going to burn and his children would be lost because of his dirty remarks about Mussolini. A bus driver later reported seeing people throwing balls of fire at the roof. Sylvia, the youngest, would later find a hard, dark green rubber object resembling a hand grenade in the brush near the home. A coroner's office issued 5 death certificates listing causes as fire or suffocation. But no bones were found in the rubble. A state inspector blamed faulty wiring. George had recently passed an electrical inspection. The West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings in 1950. But the governor and the state police superintendent told the family the case was hopeless and closed it. The FBI dropped its case after 2 years of fruitless leads. Over the decades, the Sodders received tips from across the country. A woman in St. Louis claimed one of the daughters was at a convent. A bar patron in Texas reported overhearing about the fire. In 1952, the family erected a billboard along Route 16 with the children's photos and a $5,000 reward. In the 1960s, an envelope arrived bearing a photo of a young man strongly resembling an adult version of one of the missing sons. It was postmarked from Kentucky with a cryptic message inside. George passed away in 1969. Jenny passed away in 1989, after which the billboard along Route 16 finally came down. The youngest surviving sibling, Sylvia Sauter Paxton, who had promised her parents to keep the story alive, passed away in 2021 at the age of 79. All 10 Sauter siblings are now gone. The case remains officially unresolved more than 80 years later. To this day, no one has ever explained what happened to the Sauter children. The next case takes us to October 2009 in rural Oklahoma, where a family of 3 drove out to look at a 40-acre plot of land they were thinking of buying, and only their hungry dog would come back. The Jamison family. In October 2009, a small family in eastern Oklahoma drove out to the Sans Bois Mountains to look at a piece of property they were considering buying. They never returned. 8 days later, hunters found their abandoned pickup truck at a remote well pad site. Inside were their wallets, their phones, their daughter's stuffed animals, approximately $32,000 in cash, and their dog, alive but starved. The family of 3 would not be found for another 4 years. To this day, no cause of death has ever been determined. The Jamisons of Eufaula, Oklahoma, were Bobby Dale Jamison, 44 years old, his wife Sherilyn, 40, and their 6-year-old daughter, Madison. Both adults were on disability at the time. Bobby suffered chronic back pain from a 2003 car accident. Sherilyn had reportedly developed bipolar disorder following the 2007 loss of her sister. The family lived in a house on Eufaula Lake. Bobby was in the middle of a bitter lawsuit and protective order petition against his own father, Bob Dean Jamison, claiming his father had struck him with a vehicle in November 2008 and threatened the family. Bob Dean Jamison would pass away in December 2009, 2 months after the disappearance, naming Madison as the sole beneficiary of his estate in a will dated October 2008. How does a small Oklahoma family drive 30 miles to look at a piece of property and walk into a wilderness so completely that even with helicopters, dogs, and horses, no one finds them for 4 years? On October 8th, 2009, the family drove about 30 miles to the Sans Bois Mountains near Red Oak to view a 40-acre plot they were considering buying. They planned to live in a storage container on the property. On October 16, 2009, hunters found their abandoned pickup at a remote well pad site near Kinta, Latimer County. Inside the truck were their identification cards, their wallets, their mobile phones, their GPS, Sherilyn's purse, their coats, and approximately $32,000 in cash, a sum the Jamisons were not known to carry. Their dog, Maisie, was alive, but severely malnourished inside the truck. What investigators found in the days that followed only deepened the mystery. Home surveillance footage time-stamped to the day they left showed Bobby and Sherilyn making silent, trance-like trips between vehicle and home. Sherilyn placed a brown briefcase in the vehicle that has never been found. The Jamisons had reportedly told their pastor, Gary Brandon, that they had seen spirits inside their home. Sherilyn's mother, Connie Cocotan, claimed her daughter was on an Oklahoma cult hit list. An 11-page letter written from Sherilyn to Bobby was found inside the truck. The couple appeared emaciated and gaunt in the surveillance footage. Over 100 searchers, helicopters, horses, and cadaver dogs combed the rugged Sans Bois mountain terrain in the weeks that followed. They found nothing. On November 16, 2013, more than 4 years after the family vanished, deer hunters discovered skeletal remains of 2 adults and 1 child in the Smokestack Hollow area of Panola Mountain. The remains were located about 2 7/10 miles from where the family's truck had been abandoned. The bodies were lying face down, side by side. On July 3, 2014, the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office confirmed the remains were Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison, but the autopsy results were inconclusive. The skeletal remains were incomplete. Animal damage had been extensive. No cause of death could ever be established. One report mentioned a small hole in Bobby's skull, but it could not be determined if it was a bullet wound. Theories have ranged from a methamphetamine connection to a murder-suicide pact to local cult activity. The Sans Bois region is known for methamphetamine activity, and Bobby had recently reported a local meth lab to authorities. Both adults suffered from depression, which has fed the murder-suicide theory. The case remains officially unsolved. Then Latimer County Sheriff Israel Beauchamp quit the force in 2011 and moved overseas, reportedly haunted by guilt. The case was profiled on Investigation Discovery's Disappeared series in an episode titled Paradise Lost. Of all the unsolved cases in this video, the Jameson case stands out for one reason. Investigators have the bodies. They have the truck. They have surveillance footage of the family in the hours before they left. They have everything except an answer. The next case takes us to a quiet harbor in Craig, Alaska, in early September 1982, where a 58-foot fishing boat would be set on fire with 8 people aboard. The investor murders. In September 1982, a brand new 58-foot fishing boat tied up at a small dock in Craig, Alaska, on Prince of Wales Island. 8 people were aboard, including a young pregnant mother, her husband, their 2 small children, and 4 young crew members. 2 days later, residents of Craig watched the boat burn in the harbor. Witnesses saw a man pilot the burning boat out into the bay and then return alone in a skiff. All 8 people aboard were found to have been killed. 43 years later, no one has ever been convicted. The case is still considered the largest unsolved mass killing in Alaska's history. On September 5, 1982, the 58-foot fiberglass salmon seiner investor tied up at the North Harbor Dock in Craig, Alaska, about 201 miles southeast of Juneau. Aboard were 8 people, all from the Bellingham, Washington area. They were skipper Mark Colthurst, 28, his pregnant wife Irene, 28, their children Kimberly and John, and crew members Jerome Keown, Dean Moon, Mike Stewart, and Chris Heyman. Colthurst was an overnight success in commercial fishing, with a boat estimated at between $850,000 and $1 million. He had told friends he wanted to retire by the age of 50. How does a fishing boat carrying a young family and 4 young men get attacked at a small-town harbor in the middle of a busy fishing season, with witnesses everywhere, and never produce a conviction? On the afternoon of September 7, 1982, residents of Craig saw the investor burning. Witnesses saw a man pilot the boat to a bay outside town and return in a small skiff. Investigators eventually recovered 7 bodies. A coroner's jury ruled all 8 people aboard had been killed. Forensic evidence included bullet fragments from Mark and Irene's bodies, gasoline used as accelerant, and the absence of carbon monoxide in the lungs, which indicated the victims had been deceased before the fire started. It remains Alaska's largest unsolved mass killing. Eyewitness accounts varied. Alaska state troopers eventually developed a composite of a white man in his late teens or early 20s, around 5 feet 9 to 6 feet tall, about 160 pounds, with dirty blonde or light brown hair and black rectangular framed glasses. After 2 years of tips, investigators focused on a young man named John Kenneth Peel of Bellingham, Washington. Peel matched the composite. He had been in Craig the night of the killings. He was working aboard a different boat called the Libby 8. He had been fired by Colthurst in 1981 and had previously dated Irene's sister. Police theorized that resentment over being fired had driven Peel to take revenge on Coldhurst, then to silence the witnesses. Peel had no prior criminal history. He was newly married with a young child and was described by people who knew him as a real pleasant guy. But he reportedly failed multiple polygraph tests. In September 1984, Alaska charged him with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of first-degree arson, with bond set at $1 million. The first trial began in Ketchikan in January 1986. The trial lasted 6 months. It was the longest and most expensive in Alaska history at that time. It ended in a hung jury deadlocked 7-5 favoring not guilty. The 1988 retrial ended in acquittal. In 1990, Peel sued Alaska for $150 million. The state settled for $900,000 in 1997. In 2017, Alaska State Troopers spokesman Tim Despain stated the case was officially closed. The Alaska Department of Public Safety formally declared the case closed that same year. Peel maintains his innocence to this day. The case has been the subject of a University of Alaska thesis titled "Memory on Trial: The Manhunt for Alaska's Most Elusive Mass Murderer" by author Brittany Rutherford, of multiple books by author Leland Hale, and of Case File True Crime Podcast, Episode 242, The Investor Murders. No new arrests or developments have been publicly announced through 2025 and into 2026. The 8 people who boarded that boat in early September 1982 never made it home. Their case sits today exactly where it sat 43 years ago, with a single suspect who was tried twice, acquitted once, and continues to live as a free man. The next case takes us back more than 150 years, to the open prairie of post-Civil War Kansas, where a family running a small inn would lure travelers in for a meal and trap them on the wrong side of a curtain. The Bender family. In the early 1870s, a family of 4 arrived in eastern Kansas, claiming to be spiritualists. They built a small one-room cabin and inn along a popular wagon road just outside the town of Cherryvale. They served meals to travelers passing through. Over the next 2 years, men carrying cash for land claims would stop for dinner and never be seen again. By the time anyone noticed, at least 11 people had vanished. When investigators finally arrived to question the family, they were already gone. The Benders were never captured. They are now considered the first documented serial killing family in American history. After the Civil War, Osage land in Labette County, Kansas, was opened to homesteaders. In 1870, several families of so-called spiritualists settled in western Labette County, about 7 miles northeast of Cherryvale. Among them were the Benders, made up of John Bender Sr., his wife Elvira, and the 2 adult children, John Jr. and Kate. They established a 160-acre homestead along the Osage Mission Trail and ran a small inn and store. Author Susan Jonosas, who wrote the definitive modern account, believes that Kate and the woman called Ma were probably biological mother and daughter, while Kate and John Jr., whose real name was John Gebhardt, were likely common-law married, meaning they presented themselves as family when they were not. How does a family running a small roadside inn manage to harm at least 11 travelers over a period of 2 years in a settled American county before anyone in the community noticed? The system the Benders ran was simple and brutal. Travelers carrying cash would stop at the inn for a meal. Inside the one-room cabin, a heavy curtain divided the space. Guests were seated with their backs to the curtain, where Pa or John Gebhardt waited in the back room with a hammer. After the strike, the body would be dropped through a trap door into the cellar. Once dark fell, the bodies were carried out and buried in the orchard behind the cabin. The family's downfall came when they targeted the wrong man. Dr. William York, the brother of Kansas State Senator Alexander York, vanished after stopping at the Bender Inn in March 1873. Senator York organized a 50-man search party. He came to the Bender homestead and questioned the family on March 28, 1873. The community held a township meeting at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse to obtain warrants and return for further questioning. By the time investigators came back, the entire family had fled. On May 9, 1873, two men investigating the abandoned Bender property noticed a strange depression in the soil and began to dig. What they found is hard to describe in safe language. At least 11 bodies were eventually recovered from the orchard and from the surrounding prairie, including Dr. York and a man named George Launcher, who had been traveling with his young daughter. All of them had impact wounds to the head. Kansas Governor Thomas Osborne offered a $2,000 reward for the Bender's capture, later increased to $5,000. The family was never officially found. The original Kansas Historical Society marker concluded with this single line: "The end of the Benders is not known. The earth seemed to swallow them as it had their victims." Theories of their fate include vigilante justice, escape to Mexico, or quiet death in obscurity. In August 1880, the Chicago Tribune reported the elder two Benders had been arrested in Nebraska and confessed, but the claim was never confirmed. In 1889, two women identified as the Bender women were brought back to Kansas, but their identities were eventually proven false. In the summer of 2023, the Kansas Geological Survey under Blair Schneider used remote sensing on the Bender homestead. And in 2024, Lauren Norman led a University of Kansas anthropology field school excavating the property. The team has recovered approximately 1,200 artifacts and plans further excavation. The current property owner hopes to one day establish a museum on the site. The case remains historically unresolved more than 150 years later. The Benders are now classified academically as one of America's first documented serial killing family cases. Whether they were lynched in secret by a Kansas vigilante posse, or whether they slipped quietly into another life under different names, no one will ever know for certain. The earth, as the original Kansas Historical Society marker had said, simply seemed to swallow them. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case takes us to a winter night in Northern California in 1978, where 5 men drove home from a college basketball game and disappeared into the Plumas National Forest in a way no one has ever been able to explain. The Yuba County Five. On the night of February 24, 1978, 5 men from Yuba City, California, drove together to a college basketball game in Chico. They had a Special Olympics tournament scheduled for the next morning. They never made it home. 4 days later, their car would be found abandoned on a high mountain dirt road, dramatically off route, with a quarter tank of gas and the keys still inside. Months later, the bodies of 4 of them would be found in the surrounding mountains. The 5th has never been found. The case is still open today, 47 years later. On the evening of February 24, 1978, 5 men drove together in Jack Madruga's 1969 turquoise Mercury Montego to a college basketball game between Chico State and the University of California, Davis. The men, known to their families as the Boys, all played on the same Special Olympics-supported basketball team. Jack Madruga was a quiet introvert, a U.S. Army veteran, and the meticulous owner of the Montego. Bill Sterling was an avid bowler. Ted Weiher was a gentle, large man who weighed about 200 pounds. Jackie Hewitt could not read, write, or dial a telephone. Gary Mathias was a paranoid schizophrenic and U.S. Army veteran who had been medically discharged in the early 1970s, but was, by 1978, considered one of his clinic's success cases. How does a group of 5 men who are deeply attached to their routines leave a basketball game on a familiar route home and end up 70 miles east on a high mountain dirt road covered in snow? After the game in Chico, the men were last seen on convenience store surveillance buying snacks and drinks. On February 28, 1978, a Plumas National Forest ranger spotted Madruga's Montego abandoned on a high mountain dirt road off Oroville-Quincy Road, dramatically off route, about 70 miles east of the Chico to Yuba City corridor. The car was in good working order. It started cleanly. It still held a quarter tank of gas. It was only lightly stuck in shallow snow. 5 healthy men could have pushed it out. Inside were empty wrappers, basketball game programs, and a neatly folded California road map. After the snow melted in June, motorcyclists found a U.S. Forest Service trailer, 19.5 miles north of the abandoned car at the Daniel Zink campgrounds. What investigators discovered inside the trailer is one of the most disturbing crime scenes in modern American cold case work. Ted Weiher's body lay on a bed wrapped in 8 sheets, including over the head. He had passed away of starvation and hypothermia, having lost nearly half his body weight. His beard suggested he had survived between 8 and 13 weeks alone in the trailer. The setting around him was beyond strange. The trailer's fireplace was unused despite ample matches and paperback novels for kindling. A locker held enough dehydrated food to feed all 5 men for a year, but it had not been opened. A nearby butane tank that would have powered the heater was untouched. Weiher's wallet, with cash, and his ring engraved with his name, were on the bedside table. Most strangely of all, Matthias's own shoes were sitting in the trailer, suggesting he had swapped them for Weiher's larger pair, presumably for snow. The skeletal remains of Madruga and Sterling were found 8 miles short of the trailer on opposite sides of the mountain road. Hewitt's remains were found closer to the trailer. All had been reduced to bones by scavenging animals. 3 Forest Service blankets and a rusted flashlight were found about a quarter mile northwest of the trailer, suggesting at least one of the men had walked away from it, blanketed, and not survived. Gary Matthias has never been found. The case remains officially unsolved. An October 8, 2020 internal Yuba County Sheriff's Office memo states, Gary Matthias is believed to be a victim of foul play, and that the case remains open as a missing person and homicide case. The case has been called the American Dyatlov Pass. It was the subject of Netflix's Files of the Unexplained, Season 1, Episode 3, in 2024. The next case takes us to a small mobile home in southern Illinois in November 1987, where a young water plant operator's family of 3 would be lost in a single night. The Dardeen family. In November 1987, a young husband and father in southern Illinois failed to show up for his shift at the local water treatment plant. His supervisor called both of his divorced parents. His father drove to the family's mobile home with a key. Inside, deputies discovered a scene so brutal that detectives across multiple counties would spend decades trying to make sense of it. The family of 3 would soon become a family of 4, with one of the cruelest discoveries that American crime has ever recorded. 38 years later, the case is still officially unsolved. Russell Keith Dardeen and his wife Ruby Elaine, both of whom went by their middle names, had bought a mobile home in 1986 outside Ina in Jefferson County, Illinois. Keith, 29, was a treatment plant operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District. Elaine worked at an office supply store. They had a young son, Peter, and Elaine was 7 months pregnant with a daughter they planned to name Casey. The family played in their Baptist church's musical ensemble. Keith was the lead singer. Elaine played piano. after a young girl was lost in the area to a violent attack in May 1987. Keith had become extremely protective of his family. He had told relatives he wanted to move back to his hometown of Mount Carmel. How does a small Baptist family in a quiet rural town vanish from a mobile home with no signs of forced entry, with no witnesses, and with their lives snapped off in a single November night? Keith failed to report to his shift at the water treatment plant on November 18, 1987. After his supervisor called both of his divorced parents in Mount Carmel, Keith's father, Don Dardine, drove to the mobile home with the key. Inside the trailer, deputies discovered Elaine and the young Peter inside the home, both lost to a violent attack. During the attack, Elaine had given birth prematurely to her newborn daughter. The newborn was also lost in the same attack. The next day, hunters in a nearby field found Keith's body. He had been shot in the head. What followed was one of the largest investigations in Southern Illinois history. 30 detectives worked full-time, interviewing more than 100 people and tracking over 1,000 leads. 150 evidentiary items were labeled, and more than 20 thick Dardine binders were compiled. DNA samples from the victims have been preserved, but no suspect DNA matches have ever been found. Police briefly considered a known traveling offender named Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, often called the Railroad Killer, who had a similar pattern of attacking near rail tracks. The Dardine home sat very close to the old Illinois Central Railroad line. The most haunting confession in the case came years later from a different traveling offender, after his arrest in Texas in late 1999 for a separate violent crime against a young woman, in which a second young woman survived and identified him. A man named Tommy Lynn Sells began confessing to dozens of crimes across the country. He claimed he had killed the Dardines. He claimed he had met Keith at either a truck stop or a pool hall and been invited home. Keith's mother, Joanne, found the story absurd, given how protective her son had been. When pressed for details that had not been made public, Sells initially answered incorrectly, then guessed correctly only on details that were already public knowledge. Texas law prohibited transferring death row inmates out of state, so Illinois investigators could not take Sells back to Ina to test his knowledge of the scene firsthand. Authorities believed Sells was making false confessions to delay his execution. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed in Texas on April 3, 2014, at the age of 49. His final words included the phrase, "I'm glad I finally got caught. I was tired of doing this." The Dardine case remains officially unsolved. Jefferson County investigators consider Sells the most likely person responsible, but cannot charge him. Joanne Dardine has stated she is 99% sure Sells did it, but she also wonders if he had help. The next case takes us back even further, to the Christmas season of 1959, where a young Florida ranching family would be lost just 34 days after a famous Kansas farmhouse killing made the same kind of headlines. The Walker family. On Saturday, December 19, 1959, a young Florida ranch family of 4 was lost inside their wood-frame cottage on a working ranch in Sarasota County. The husband had been a ranch hand. The wife had taught Sunday school. They had 2 young children. The killer left behind a bloody boot print, a cool cigarette wrapper, and a fingerprint on the bathtub faucet. The case has gone unsolved for 66 years. The 2 men suspected by some investigators were not local. They had killed a different family in Kansas exactly 34 days earlier. Their names were Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, and Truman Capote would later make them famous in a book called In Cold Blood. Cliff Walker, 25, was a ranch hand managing a herd of deep red cows for $55 a week and was an aspiring pilot. His wife, Christine, 24, was a Sunday school teacher. Their children were Jimmy, 3, and Debbie, who was almost 2. The family had spent the day looking at used cars in Sarasota. Cliff was considering buying his wife a two-tone 1956 Chevrolet 210. How does a young ranching family in 1959 Florida become the target of a brutal home attack just 1 month after a near-identical attack on the Clutter family in Kansas? And have the case stay unsolved for more than 60 years? Investigators believe Christine arrived home first around 4 in the afternoon, where she was attacked and lost. Cliff returned with the children in his work Jeep. He was ambushed and shot through his straw cowboy hat. The 2 children were also lost inside the home. Crime scene evidence included bloody high-heeled pumps Christine had used to fight. With her heels stained with the killer's blood, a bloody cowboy boot print, a cellophane strip from a cool cigarette wrapper, and a fingerprint on the bathtub faucet handle. The bodies were found by a fellow ranch hand named Don McLeod the next morning when he came by to go hog hunting. Just 34 days earlier, on November 15, 1959, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith had attacked the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas. The case would later be immortalized in Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood. The pair had stolen a 1956 Chevy Bel Air and fled to Florida. They checked out of a Miami Beach motel the morning of December 19th and shopped at a Sarasota department store that day, just miles from the Walker home. Witnesses said the taller man had a scratched-up face. Investigators believe Hickok and Smith may have gained entry to the Walkers' home by pretending to sell their stolen Bel Air, exactly the model the Walkers were considering buying. Hickok and Smith were arrested in Las Vegas on December 30th, 1959, and hanged on April 14th, 1965. A 1960s-era polygraph appeared to clear them. But later experts said early polygraphs of that era were worthless. Sarasota County Detective Kim McGath reopened the case in 2007 and investigated for 5 years. On December 18th, 2012, Smith's and Hickok's bodies were exhumed from Mount Muncie Cemetery in Kansas. In August 2013, the Sarasota Sheriff's Office announced that only partial DNA profiles could be retrieved, and the Walker crime scene samples were too degraded for a definitive match. The result neither proved nor disproved involvement. Investigators have stated Hickok and Smith remain the most viable suspects. McGath also identified a circular sole print from a cat's paw rubber cushioned sole, which Smith was known to wear, found in blood at both the Walker and Clutter scenes. Her supervisors eventually shut down her boot print investigation. Forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland of DeSales University has argued the killer likely knew the Walkers based on what was stolen. Other suspects were considered over the years. Serial offender Emmett Monroe Spencer confessed to the case, but was discredited as a pathological liar by then Sheriff Ross Boyer. Boyer also briefly consulted a New Jersey psychic. Hundreds of suspects were considered overall. The case remains unsolved. As of 2023, Detective Brandon Clark was the latest of a dozen investigators on the case. Christine's half-brother, Pat Myers, now in his 70s and reported to have 16 cardiac stents, continues advocating for resolution. Sarasota County Sheriff Kurt Hoffman convened a Florida Cold Case Investigators Commission session in 2024 to apply fresh eyes to the case. The case has been profiled on Investigation Discovery's A Crime to Remember and on the Florida Sheriff's Association's official podcast. The next case takes us to the small town of Chesnee, South Carolina, on a quiet November afternoon in 2003, where 4 people inside a high-performance motorcycle dealership were lost in a matter of minutes. The Superbike Motorsport Murders. On the afternoon of November 6, 2003, a friend stopped by a high-performance motorcycle dealership in the small town of Chesnee, South Carolina. He found 4 people inside, all lost to gunshots. 2 of them were the owner and his mother. The other 2 were close friends and co-workers. The shop had just won a Suzuki award. The cash register was untouched. The case sat cold for 13 years, generating wild theories that included Mexican drug gangs and love triangles. The break would not come until November 2016, when a young woman was found chained inside a metal shipping container in a different South Carolina town at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon on November 6, 2003. A friend named Noel arrived at Superbike Motorsports, a high-performance motorcycle dealership in Chesney, South Carolina, founded in January 2001 by Scott Ponder. Inside, he found 4 people lost to gunshot wounds. Scott Ponder, 30, was the owner. Beverly Guy, 52, was Scott's mother and the shop's bookkeeper. Brian Lucas, 29, was the service manager and Scott's best friend. Christopher Sherbert, 26, was the shop's mechanic. How does a quadruple shooting at a small-town motorcycle dealership in broad daylight in a busy commercial district sit unsolved for 13 years before someone in another county finally cracks the case by accident? Chris and Beverly were in the back of the store. Scott was found in the parking lot. Brian was found at the main doorway. The shop had won a Suzuki Award that year. Nothing had been taken from the business. An envelope of cash had been left in plain sight. Investigators recovered 18 shell casings from a 9mm weapon, some brass and some nickel-plated. Over the next 13 years, 27 confiscated weapons were tested, and casings were sent to England for emerging forensic technology. No match emerged. Theories ranged from a Mexican drug gang to a love triangle. Scott's widow Melissa was at one point wrongly cast under suspicion. The break in the case came from a different investigation entirely. In late August 2016, a young woman named Carla Brown and her boyfriend Charles David Carver disappeared after going to work for a registered sex offender named Todd Colehep. On November 3, 2016, Spartanburg County deputies executed a search warrant and found Brown chained by her neck inside a 30 by 15-foot metal shipping container on Colehep's nearly 100-acre Woodruff property. She had been held there for 2 months. Carver's body was found on the property. Investigators also found the bodies of a married couple, Johnny Joe Coxey and his wife Megan, who had vanished in December 2015. After his arrest, Colehep confessed to the Chesney killings on or about November 5, 2016, in exchange for being allowed to see his mother, give her a photograph, and transfer money to a friend's child's college fund. According to Sheriff Chuck Wright, Colehep revealed details only the killer would have known. His mother told CNN he had visited Superbike to learn to ride a motorcycle, and they laughed at him when he fell over on the bike. That humiliation, she said, allegedly motivated the entire massacre. Todd Christopher Colehep had been born March 7, 1971, in Florida and raised in South Carolina and Georgia. At the age of 15 in 1987, while living with his father in Tempe, Arizona, he had committed a violent crime against a young girl. He had served prison time, been released, and had quietly built a career as a registered sex offender turned real estate agent in Spartanburg County, buying his Woodruff farm in May 2014 for $305,000. On May 26, 2017, Colehep pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 1 count of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and 3 weapons counts. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 60 additional years. He is currently incarcerated at Broad River Correctional Institution. The case is closed. The next case takes us to the South Loop of Chicago in January 2009, where a young mother holding her baby daughter would be lost inside her own condo by a man who had been her own attorney, the Henry family. On the afternoon of January 24, 2009, a young mother in the South Loop neighborhood of Chicago was inside her condo holding her 10-month-old baby daughter. The baby's father was a former NBA center. The mother had recently fired her attorney over a fee dispute and planned to fight him in court. Within minutes, a man entered the condo and shot the young mother while she was still holding her baby. Both the mother and the infant were lost. The mother's 3-year-old son survived in the apartment for hours, with blood smears on the wall no higher than 4 feet from the floor. The man arrested was the very lawyer she had just fired. Nova Henry, 24 years old, was the on and off girlfriend of former NBA center Eddie Curry. The two had 2 children together, a 3-year-old son named Noah and a 10-month-old daughter named Ava Henry Curry. In 2006, Nova had retained Chicago attorney Frederick Goings to handle her child support case against Curry. She had also begun a romantic relationship with Goings and moved into his Chicago home. According to the testimony of Nova's mother, Yolande Henry, the relationship was tumultuous, marked by ongoing physical abuse from its inception until the shootings. When Nova hired a new lawyer and planned to fight the $24,000 in attorney's fees Goings claimed she owed, Goings became enraged. How does a young mother in a high-rise condo, with a young child in her arms and another in the next room, become the target of an attack from her own attorney? And how does that attorney end up walking out of her home, thinking he had gotten away with it? On January 24, 2009, Goings entered Nova's South Loop condo on the first block of West 15th Street and shot her while she was still holding the baby Ava. Both mother and infant were lost. Eddie Curry's 3-year-old son Noah was home but unharmed. He was later found alone in the apartment for hours, with blood smears on the wall no higher than 4 feet from the floor, the height of a small child. Yolande Henry later testified that the boy put his finger to his lips and said, "Shh," when she found him. Goings fled to Indiana. Hotel staff at a Comfort Inn in Michigan City, Indiana, would later testify that he did laundry late at night and was seen furiously cleaning his nails in an apparent attempt to wash off evidence in the hotel pool. He was arrested about a month after the killings. A Cook County jury found Goings guilty in February 2013. Eddie Curry, by then playing professionally in China, did not testify. Defense attorneys argued no physical evidence directly tied Goings to the killings. On April 4, 2013, Cook County Judge Maura Slattery Boyle sentenced Goings to natural life in prison without parole. She called him a predator and told him, "You are obsessed with yourself. You have no substance, no integrity." In his statement, Goings said, "I maintain my innocence. I loved Nova and Ava, and I'm disappointed with the jury's decision." Yolande Henry has spoken publicly ever since about the case and about domestic violence in general. She told reporters, "Domestic violence was the root of this evil act committed by Frederick Goings. No one should live in fear of their life, ever. Nova was afraid." At sentencing, she asked publicly, "Why is someone that evil, that callous, that sadistic, that only option was to brutally murder Nova and Ava?" Eddie Curry was granted custody of his son Noah, who was reported to be thriving with his father at the time of the sentencing. Goings' appeal was addressed in People v. Goings, in which the Illinois 1st District Appellate Court affirmed his conviction. He continues to serve life without the possibility of parole. The case was extensively covered by ABC 7 Chicago and by ESPN. It remains a touchstone case for Chicago domestic violence advocacy. The young son who survived the attack, the boy who put his finger to his lips and told his grandmother to be quiet, has by now grown up. Of all the cases in this video, the Henry case is the only one in which one of the victims is still alive to remember what happened. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.